Hey listeners, I love making this podcast, and I think it's important work. I love sharing these conversations with you, but it takes time and money to make it happen. I need your help to keep making it and bringing you these conversations. Would you consider supporting this podcast with a monthly donation? Monthly supporters will receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits through Patreon. You can go to the website, wdtatpodcast.com, and click on support to make a donation or sign up for the Patreon. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. On this episode, I talked to Justin Tapp about lessons we have learned living in other countries, assumptions we bring to dialogue, and the line between having convictions and keeping an open mind. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Justin Tapp, a longtime friend from way back. Welcome to the podcast, Justin.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to connect with you again.
Yeah, it was a long time ago that you and I met when we were both in grad school at Baylor University.
Go Bears. Sick 'em Bears. Yeah.
You were studying in the School of Business, and I was at the seminary at Baylor. I remember I had been connected with someone from Texas Baptist, I think, that was interested in an idea about connecting the seminary with the social work school, which already they had a dual degree, but bringing in the business school as sort of the third leg of that stool. And I was very interested in that because I had noticed that was a piece of the conversation that tended to not happen on poverty. There are a lot of people working on poverty and social justice issues between the seminary and the social work school, but we left out the business school, even probably sometimes looked down at the business school. These were just the people who wanted to make profit. And so I reached out to some professors at the business school that were working on projects to deal with global poverty, and your name got thrown into the hat, if I remember, and we connected, and it kind of started us down this like long road of having conversations and connecting around different issues and different topics. Is my memory? Does that remind you? Does that jive with what you remember?
It sounds close enough. Yeah, I don't remember how the initial introduction was made. You know, I can remember going to a larger group meeting in one of the auditoriums that dealt with. They were talking about poverty issues, and I think there was a panel of professors. And I remember one of the economics professors was kind of in that panel and was answering questions, and and I kind of connected with him afterward. And I don't know if maybe he passed my name along or what that was. That's a vague recollection.
Tell me what was it that made you interested in that specific project and getting involved in connecting with me? Probably isn't something that all business school students are interested in, same as seminary students. I guess social work students are probably all pretty interested in social justice and economics, but what made you interested in that?
So kind of coming into Baylor in 2006, I was coming off of, I'd spent 2 years overseas working in rural Azerbaijan, which was still very much a developing country, and a country that was developing towards a market economy out of a former Soviet centralized economy. And so that, I lived in an area that was fairly poor for 2 years and saw a lot of poverty, different than what I was used to seeing in the United States. And so I was kind of interested in, market approaches to things versus top-down approaches, and pursuing a degree at Baylor in international economics, with an idea that I was going to go work on world poverty, maybe for the World Bank or the IMF or something else. And so that's kind of what piqued my interest, was kind of that idea of international development and seeing people who were like-minded, interested, maybe in working overseas in different contexts or different ways, but in just kind of dealing with the greater issue of poverty.
That's interesting. What both you and I have spent time living and working overseas. What made you interested in doing that in the first place? When I was growing up, I was always interested in visiting other places and seeing the world. And my sister is okay if she never leaves Texas. She's just a very, very different person. So what is it about you and me, do you think, what for you anyways, that makes you want to be in those other places, see those other places, see economics from an international perspective?
So I think from kind of my perspective, there's Clifton's is a kind of I guess they're a business publisher or whatever. They have a thing called Strengths Finder, which is very popular among business school and certain government organizations. And, I think my second strength is learner. And so that's kind of, for me, I'm just kind of an insatiable learner. And I think I'm most satisfied in other countries where you're learning something new every day, or you're experiencing something new and different. Whether it's a new word in a language or a new way of doing things. That's just kind of...
Yeah.
My first experience overseas was in college. My church had a partnership with some missionaries and churches in Russia. I ended up in a kind of a poor city in Russia and seeing life very different from my own, and having to survive there on my own for a brief little bit. Without much support, kind of taught me some survival skills. And I just found it, I found that felt really good to be able to try and live in another context and try to learn some language and communicate with neighbors and things like that. Mm-hmm. And then also just asking the question, well, why is their life like this? How did this building get built? Or why isn't this building getting built? That kind of thing. And that sort of led me to, ask more questions and try to find the answers to those questions. And so that's kind of at the end of college, 9/11 happened basically, and I started hearing a lot more about countries near Russia, post-Soviet countries that were part of Central Asia. And I started kind of developing a fascination for those types of cultures, these cultures that have been multi-ethnic, maybe traditionally Muslim cultures that had also been under the Soviet influence, and all that just sort of fascinated me. So that's kind of what drew me to that part of the world specifically.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and something that you and I definitely, I think, have in common. The theme sort of this podcast is how we talk to each other, what makes people different, understanding our differences, but also how to have difficult conversations. And one thing that comes up again and again is curiosity being a big part of how we get past differences that we have with others. It may be that some people kind of naturally have a lot more curiosity than others. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it seems like you and I definitely have a lot of curiosity about the world and just wanting to get out there and, learn new things and encounter new things. So that helps when you're dealing with conversations that are difficult, which kind of leads me to, you and I then, after meeting at Baylor, I was blogging a lot, and then we would have a lot of conversations over email or online on my blog about different things. There were a lot of things that we did not agree on, or that were challenging to both of us. What was it that you think? Is it just that curiosity, or are there other things that make it easy for you to have those kinds of conversations? I think some people probably avoid those conversations. So what makes it attractive or interesting to you? Yeah,
it's a good question. I think, it is kind of the learner aspect. If I want to know if this person has information that I don't have, and maybe it's their own perspective, brings something to their life experiences or something that I don't have. And so they have a different way of they've experienced something differently. And I want to know about that because that's, simple information that I don't have. I think that's that's probably part of it. I think, in some ways with me, I think there's a little bit of maybe a prideful or competitive nature about it as well. And that, I want to be able to win the argument, and I can't win the argument without surveying the other side's argument as well, So I think that might be also kind of part of it. I want to be, maybe I want that other person's perspective and information because I want to be the subject matter expert to win that argument. I don't know. A strong level of intellectual curiosity, I think that's helpful. You have to want to know what the other person is thinking or what they want to say. Without that curiosity, it's hard to want to know what the other person's thinking.
Yeah, I really like the idea that other people might have information we don't have. I think growing up in my maybe less self-aware years, I would have thought that I have all the information and I'm mainly needing to distribute it to others, right? And that's how I would win a conversation, is if I can just get people to hear what I'm saying and know the things that I know, then they'll come around to my side. It's very helpful to have that assumption that other people have information that I don't have, especially when we disagree, right? That the disagreement doesn't just mean they lack something or they're missing something. Assuming that they might know something or have information or an experience that I don't changes the whole tone. It puts it in a different perspective when you're having those conversations. Yeah. So I really like that a lot. One conversation I remember you and I having, and then a story about where that conversation led us. We talked a lot about economics, obviously, because it's a passion of yours and your field. It's something I'm also passionate about, maybe a bit more of an armchair economist. But I do like reading about it and studying it. And I remember one especially long conversation you and I had back and forth about the property in the Bible and whether or not there was private property. What was the nature of economics in the Bible, and what were things that were sort of we created as human beings, and things that we saw in the Bible that were maybe what the Bible would teach about economics or property or things like that. And I remember many long back and forth about that with you. And then when I moved to Bolivia the first time, I can remember being in Santa Cruz and walking downtown, and I think I'd gone to the post office to pick up a package, or someone had given me a package that I had received that had your name on it, and I was super surprised. I was not expecting a package from you, and I opened it up, and it was this book called God the Economist by M. Douglas Meeks. I don't know if you remember sending me that.
I remember reviewing it, but I had forgotten that I had sent it to you. So I was probably a nicer guy back then than I am now.
But I remember you sending me that book, and then you sent me a message, or maybe there was a letter in with the book, and you said, I don't know that I 100% agree with your take on things, but I read this book, and I think now I can see things from your perspective. I really distinctly remember you saying that about reading that book and how you could now, having read that, see where I was coming from. Yeah. Not that you agreed with everything. What do you remember what the process was like for you reading that book and then saying, okay, maybe Lucas isn't crazy. I might not agree with everything, but at least I can understand where he's coming from.
Yeah, I think, for one, it was, you came from a different school, different background of maybe biblical interpretation or a different way of approaching the Bible than I had been familiar with. Mm-hmm. I think Dr. Meeks, his approach was kind of more in line with where you were coming from. So I could see him saying some of the same things that you had been saying. And so it was kind of and we had both sort of struggled to think about the limited number of things the Bible says about, property and economics, that there, looks even remotely like, what we experience today. I just kind of saw him kind of wrestling with some of the same types of questions and exploration. So it had kind of the ring of familiarity due to our conversations, I think. Yeah. But it's it's another thing that I still do. And, maybe to my detriment is I'm still always sending emails, or I'm emailing articles or other types of things to people saying, hey, I think you'd be interested in this article, and I always think about it, they can always just click delete on the article, and or just say I don't have time or whatever. It doesn't cost me. The marginal cost of sending that email is pretty low, copying and pasting the link and clicking send, but the odds are that there might be something in there that they really find useful or helpful, and they really like it, and they thank me for it and say, oh, wow, that's great. Thanks for sending it to me, So I feel like marginal cost is pretty low, and, potential marginal benefit is pretty high. So I keep doing that. So the postage was probably not too egregious to send that to Bolivia. So I went ahead and did it.
Yeah. Nice. You mentioned, having these kinds of conversations with other people. Have you found many other people where you can really have the kind of good back and forth, or do you find that that's rare?
Yeah, I find it kind of increasingly rare, at least corners itself. I think now I see a lot of back and forth on 140 characters on Twitter.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea, like when we were blogging back and forth, there might be days or weeks between postings, as we thought about stuff. Whereas now it's like, if it's not done over Twitter in 20 minutes, then it's just not done,
Yeah, that's true.
I feel like there's some, a little bit of back and forth. For example, Reddit has a thread called, I believe it's called Change My Mind or Change My View. And, someone will start with a hypothesis saying, this is my point of view. Tell me why I'm wrong. And then there'll be back and forth. People can comment in and they're given points awarded for, the validity of their points. And then, maybe by the end of the thread, the original poster has changed his mind or not. So I still see that taking place. I've seen some people write about that as an example of good dialogue back and forth and how to discuss and make points with one another. But I feel like, that's cloistered to just one little part of the internet, that a lot of people don't go to or aren't aware of. So, but I feel like on a day-to-day basis, it's easier just to change the channel or to tune it out than to engage somebody in a back and forth. And I think increasingly it's more maybe the wittiest comment wins on the Twitter, or the loudest voice wins, if it's on television. So I think the back and forth it's becoming a lost art.
Yeah, definitely. Well, do you have any things that you do, like practices or ways that you seek out voices that are different than yours to kind of keep up that sharpness of engaging different ideas?
I wish I could say that I really did. I think I guess the best thing that I tend to do is, I'm fortunate to have a job where there's a lot of my coworkers have different backgrounds than me, sometimes different nationalities, and we kind of all have to work together, but we may have different opinions or approaches to things. And so that kind of forces you to be aware of what the other person's thinking or where they came from. We know that, like, at the end of the day, we're all on the same team. And so that kind of helps. And sometimes we talk some issues out and get different people's perspectives based on their background or their experiences. But kind of outside of the workplace, I still read a lot of articles. There's, at least one magazine that I read cover to cover that I don't necessarily always agree with. But I think increasingly, I'm probably just like everybody else. I'm more leaning towards information that fits with my bias, kind of like a confirmation bias problem. So I think to continually do that, to want to hear from the other side, and continually try and be open to changing your mind is, it seems a greater challenge as I get older.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I have been, as I've been doing this podcast and doing some reading, that keeps coming up for me is kind of a tension between being open to changing your mind and having convictions or opinions. And, I forget exactly what the saying is about having a mind that's so open, that your brain falls out or something like that.
Yeah.
This idea that if you're open to change, or you're open to engaging other ideas, if you're too open, then you just kind of believe anything, So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. What is the balance? Because I know you and I, engaging each other, we had convictions about what we thought about the way the world worked and what was true, and the dialogue is because we didn't agree. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Like, what's the line between being true to your convictions but then being open to engaging difference?
Yeah, I think it requires a little bit of examination of where do your convictions come from? Do they come from just something you were raised with or were taught? Or do they come from learned observation over time? So, if I have continued to live in these countries and I see practices in these countries that continually lead to these particular outcomes, I'm going to reach a conclusion, a conviction in my mind about certain policies. X, Y, Z policy leads to, ABC outcome. If it was just something that I came to the table with that because that's what my dad said growing up, that's a different story. So I think, the convictions that I hold now tend to be more because I've observed certain things over time. Whereas when I was, say 25, it was more of this is what I was taught growing up, or this is what I was taught in school. And so therefore I feel strongly about it. But realizing, I think that, you have to realize, particularly at an early age or a lack of experience, that you don't have enough observations to draw conclusions. So you always have to be careful where your convictions are coming from.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. That's really hopeful. So we kind of touched on previously that you and I kind of come at economics from you mentioned coming at biblical interpretation from a different perspective. And we also came at economics from a different perspective. I tend to be more critical of capitalism, and you were in business school when we met studying economics and capitalism. And so I wonder, for people like me, maybe who lean more towards being critical of capitalism and thinking about ways that we could maybe construct different systems, or imagining, other options, what would you want people to know or to understand about economics and capitalism that you think people maybe don't understand very well?
I think, there's always one thing I keep coming back to in my mind is, the importance of that people respond to incentives. Time and again in various arguments I see presented, there's a lack of understanding that if you raise the cost of doing something, people are going to do less of it. So if you raise the price of something, people are going to buy less of it. So that's, if you raise the cost of doing business, for example, or you increase the tax on somebody's, the marginal dollar that they earn, that decreases the incentive for the person to build that business or to earn that additional dollar. Those are things that often get lost, when people start talking about, 75% marginal tax rates or whatever. So I think tends to be one of the bigger ones that I've seen, particularly on books that I've read, where an author is trying to persuade the other person, you may have really good intentions, but you have to remember that, incentives matter. I think, just as one simple one, but it's also kind of an assumption that somebody not trained in economics doesn't think about that would be a false assumption too. I think that answered your question, but it's just one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think it also helps when you're thinking about, maybe it's helpful when you're thinking about dialogue. That people respond to incentives.
Yeah.
We tend to engage dialogue with demands or in this, you mentioned before you're can engage dialogue in a very like competitive way, and I definitely identify with that as well. And that doesn't always result in people having an incentive to engage or feel like it's worth putting themselves out there, right? And so we could maybe think about that too, as how can we create incentives for people to engage in better dialogue. And maybe, like you're saying with Twitter with 140 characters, or I've seen lots of these social apps that have different kinds of social capital that you kind of gain from liking other people's things or doing whatever. And so the incentive becomes like, well, the engagement is very surface level and very not very deep, and people respond to that incentive too in terms of how they engage with other people through these different platforms. So that's a really interesting idea to think about, to maybe pull from economics and into dialogue. I like that.
I think, it's one thing that I was thinking of as we were talking, someone I guess in the last presidential election just kind of made the point that, these days, for example, a presidential debate where there's a lot of back and forth, it's usually, at the end of the day, it's the soundbite that you're looking for. Whoever has the most pithy statement that can be easily put into a, 6-second soundbite that gets played on the evening news, that's what will get the airplay and the exposure, whereas back in the day, there were the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, and these things went on. I mean, these debates were hours long, like the debates themselves would take you hours to read, and it's like, does the populace really have the desire to have that level of conversation anymore? We don't want a debate that lasts 6 hours. We want one that's over, by 9 p.m. so I can go to bed or whatever, So I think the fast pace of our culture tends to lead to, just sort of that instant, I'm going to give this thing 20 seconds, whereas something might actually require 20 minutes of thinking. I think that kind of helps. You have to create the space. We're kind of having our dialogues, back in 2006, 2007, when there was no Twitter, when there was we didn't all have smartphones that we were on all the time, and it was a lot easier just to sit. We had nothing better to do, more or less, than sit around and have conversations, So,
Yeah, that's so true. Well, and even in our, lifetime, the way that we've seen the changes in the U.S. in the political process, especially in like presidential campaigns. You mentioned debates, and we're recording this on August 22nd, 2019, and the Democrats are having debates. I think yesterday another candidate dropped out, and the first couple of debates that they had to do it over 2 nights because there were 20 candidates that they qualified for the debates. But the Democrats weren't the first ones to do that, right? Both times that Trump was running, there was an equal number there were probably 15 Republican candidates. And it was equally like mind-boggling to try and wrestle with the number of candidates and who were these people? What did they really think? Well, why would, and like you're saying, it becomes, can this candidate get the headline by getting a punchline in on another candidate? What does that actually tell us about who we want, or who we might want as a candidate for either side? And it doesn't serve us very well for finding good candidates. But it fits with, like you're saying, it fits with the sort of same stories that were being sold in reality television and sound bites the rest of the time. And so it seems like it's sort of creeped into our politics.
Yeah.
It's very, very unfortunate. I can remember, I don't know if you remember, there was a governor's race in California where I think there was a porn star running. I think Gary Coleman was running. And I just remember that race very, very clearly as being sort of a laughing stock. Like the rest of the nation at the time was like, it's so ridiculous. Like, what is happening in California that they have this sort of circus going on?
Yeah.
And we all thought it was real funny. And now it feels like it's not so funny anymore because it's just what's happening on the bigger stages and in the rest of our process.
Yeah.
And perhaps we are part of what's driving that, because we're not willing to do the deeper dive into those issues.
And I think, the institutions that we have were designed for greater debate. I think there's a reason the Lincoln Douglas debates were hours long. Our Senate, for example, is designed to primarily be a way of talking things out. It was designed after the, Roman Senate, where that's pretty much, what the point of it was dialogue. That's not necessarily what we want today. We want more action or less dialogue. But, we take for granted the fact that the institutions that we had built were designed for reading and reflection and, assumed literacy, for example, of the people that were elected. And so that's kind of a crucial, thing, that our institutions are built that way, but we no longer really operate that way as a society, it seems, at least from an American point of view. So
what's an insight that you feel like as you've lived in other countries and traveled, that you've gained personally, either for your own life or in terms of economics, that you think someone outside the US, someone that doesn't travel outside the US or might not be engaging people from other countries and really having to wrestle with those sorts of things. I'm interested first in economics, and then if you have any personal anecdotes as well about insights or things that you have learned from traveling that you would want to share with others.
The best I could do is, send people articles to read, or, I recommend a book, two economists, Robinson and Ajemolu. They wrote the book Why Nations Fail. And, it was based on their research into centuries of various civilizations and countries and what they found to be true as far as failure. As I have traveled around the world and recommended that book to people and met people in other countries that have read that book and agree, to me, it comes down to, where you see political exclusivity and economic exclusivity, those types of things together tend to lead to stagnation and greater centralized control and less freedom and less growth. Things like, when you see people that become very economically strong and then they use that newfound economic power to then capture the political power to exclude people from gaining political power that they don't like, then you have kind of basically an oligarchy that runs the politics. That's the recipe for basic disaster that plays itself out throughout history. And I have seen different flavors of that in the countries that I've lived, and that pretty much, describes, that fits with what I've seen. So that kind of economically, that's what, and I think, and the reason that's the same in all countries across time is, I think, because largely people are, largely more or less the same everywhere you go. We all have the same basic wants and needs, and everybody responds to incentives. It looks different in every country, either cultural norms or what incentives you're responding to. But the basic nature of people is the same everywhere. We all, are endowed by the Creator with a lot of the same things. So
yeah, that book's been on my list for a while because you recommended it to me as well, and I haven't gotten around to reading it yet. But I might move it up on my list now that you've recommended it again.
Yeah, it only reinforces my particular biases, so it's great.
Well, it'll be good for me to read and challenge my biases probably. I like to wrap up the show with 3 things: something that we learned or something that just rises to the surface, an idea or an insight to us, something that we could do or recommend that people do as an action, and then a resource that we might recommend. It could be something you've already recommended, or another resource people could check out. And I'll go first. I really liked your insight about engaging people in dialogue with the assumption that they have information that you don't have, and that's something that I think will stick with me. I like that idea that when we disagree, there might be a lack of information, something we're missing, and so then being curious about trying to find that information or understand that is a great way to engage people, or a great assumption to have when you're engaging in a dialogue where you disagree with somebody. I really like that idea. And then something we can do is also something that you suggested about examining our convictions, that examining beliefs that we have. That's a great practice. I think we all have beliefs, even if you and I have spent a lot of years as we've gotten older with the march of time, we probably still have beliefs and convictions that we haven't maybe thought about, or that we've just assumed that are correct, or we haven't even examined them. We haven't even thought about why do I have that preference, or why do I believe something is a certain way. And so it's great when something comes up, or especially when something challenges us. You and I, living in different countries, other cultures, have the opportunity to be challenged a lot with our beliefs, our convictions, our preferences, and our ideas. And so it comes up a lot for us to have to say, well, why do I believe that, or why do I prefer things that way? But taking time when something does challenge us, when we do disagree, to ask ourselves, well, why do I believe that? And spend some time examining our convictions, as you said. Where did that come from? I think that's kind of how you phrased it, and I really like that question. Where did that belief or that conviction come from? And then asking some questions about digging into where did I get that idea, especially the ones that we haven't maybe examined yet. And a recommended resource for me, I'll recommend the God the Economist book that you recommended to me. I'll also recommend I had a conversation with my friend Gary, who was on a different podcast. I think you, me, and Gary Goodson were sometimes in online conversations together on my blog. So I don't know if you remember Gary.
Yeah. How's he doing?
But he's doing good. Yeah. He and I read a book together. I'm going to have to look up the name of it because we are both not economists, and we were wanting to talk about economics, and we thought, well, before we both kind of weighed in with not knowing very much and trying to have these conversations about economics, I think I asked you for a recommendation about what a good book would be, and you recommended it's a book. It's something about like lessons from dead economists, or I forget what what the name of it is.
You're correct.
If we can't think of it, I'll look it up and add it to the show notes.
It's Todd Buchholz's New Ideas from Dead Economists.
New Ideas from Dead Economists, yeah. And I thought that was a great resource that kind of gives you an overview of the history of economic ideas and helps you talk maybe a little more intelligently about the different ideas and different stages in economics. So I'll recommend that book, and I'll also recommend a book by a guy named David Graeber called Debt: The First 5,000 Years. I think that's right. I'll check on the title, which I read a few years ago, and has some very interesting ideas, ideas about economics and where they come from, and the role that credit or debt plays. And he's actually, I think, an anthropologist, and so he also comes at it from a different angle, looking at different human societies and how they have organized themselves economically, and so asking questions that like what worked better and didn't work, and different kinds of economies, the gift economy and things like that. So I also recommend that book. That was a bunch of recommendations all at once, but your turn. What was something you learned, something that people could do, and a recommended resource?
So kind of bear with me here a little bit. So something we learned, is that from our discussion tonight, or just in general, or from...
Could be either, yeah. If something came up in our discussion, or if there's just something else that you've learned that you want to share.
Yeah, I think, just always keep in mind that the other person may have information that you don't have. And almost, just assume that, right now I work in a job where I have to make decisions based on a limited amount of information. And I try to be mindful of the fact that, the little information that I have doesn't tell the whole story. There's a whole lot of other things that took place and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears before something ends up in front of me. And I don't know the whole story. And so I need to be very careful, if my decision can affect somebody's life, that I may not have all the information. That's always, I think, try to be intellectually humble. It can be difficult the older you get, but it's a good challenge, I guess. I think something anybody could do is to, make a friend with somebody who's different than you. I mean, that sounds silly. One easy way of doing that is, get your passport and travel abroad, and see who you meet. I've met a lot of random strangers just on basic vacation trips, whether it was random Australian book author or random Korean coffee store owner or something, that ended up, being able to be friends and stay in dialogue with over time. That's something that's been valuable to me. And then hearing their perspectives about things over time has been challenging for me. So that's something, just make a friend in another culture. Recommended resources. So, I mentioned one that's kind of fun to check out, which is the Reddit thread, Change My View. And so you can see people in there dialoguing with one another, trying to change each other's minds about things and the conclusions that they reach. That's kind of an interesting thing to look at. It's Durana Jemolu and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail. A much more simple book that I used to give when I was teaching economics. It came from a professor at Baylor. It's Charles M. North's Good Intentions, 9 hot button issues viewed through the eyes of faith. That's a small book, but it deals with issues like, everything from divorce to things like minimum wage, just kind of different ways of thinking about how the left and right think about things, and that things may not always be what, it's kind of trying to get both sides to look at the other's point of view. Is kind of the point of the book, I think. So those are both resources I would recommend. Great.
Yeah. I always like to say, you and I are very lucky to travel and get to live in other countries. And I try to remember that is a privilege that not everybody has. So when talking about travel, I always want to remind people living in the U.S., for example, that there's a lot of diversity very close to your neighborhood in your city. Wherever you live, even in a lot of smaller towns like Waco, there's a lot of diversity right around you. And try to, in Waco, go to 25th Street and visit some of the Latino businesses and start up conversations with people about their story and where they're from. And there's a lot of ways that you can engage travel, especially in the United States, without ever having to leave, because you have a lot of that's diversity right in your backyard. Yeah. And I think that's an important reminder. Well, Justin, this has been fun. I really enjoyed getting a chance to reconnect with you and hear some of your thoughts and catch up with you. And I really appreciate you giving your time with us on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. Best of luck with it. I hope it goes far.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on Support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?